Smooth muscle is muscle that is found all throughout the body. So, for example, we find smooth muscle in every artery. Okay, we find smooth muscle, a small amount of it, in every vein. The digestive tract is, for the most part, made of smooth muscle, right, from the mid esophagus all the way down to the anal sphincter. Um, and we're also going to see smooth muscle play a role like in the lungs, controlling the size of airways. So smooth muscle has a very important role in the body because it's involved in so many different organs. So we're going to talk just a little bit about some of the things, some characteristics of smooth muscle, so that when we talk about it, you will have a better understanding of what it is we're talking about. Okay, so we call it smooth because it doesn't have striations. We don't have, in smooth muscle, we don't have sarcomeres. Remember, it's sarcomeres that create that very rigid structure, that very rigid appearance. Cardiac muscle has sarcomeres. Skeletal muscle, sarcomeres. Smooth muscle, no sarcomeres. Now, interestingly, actin and myosin are still present. They're just not present in that rigid arrangement that creates the sarcomere. So instead of actin and myosin being arranged in these very careful parallel bundles, in smooth muscle, actin and myosin are arranged in a more three-dimensional way, where they're sort of going in all different directions. So it means that smooth muscle contracts not linearly like skeletal muscle does, but smooth muscle contracts like a sheet, like an elastic sheet gets smaller. Calcium is still the trigger for contraction, but the mechanism is significantly different. If you like to think in terms of evolutionary biology, smooth muscle is much, much older than skeletal muscle is. Therefore, it's simpler. It has a simpler, less rigid structure. Now, we have, there's basically there's multiple kinds of smooth muscle. One is multi-unit smooth muscle. That's what we see here. This is most like skeletal muscle. Of all the smooth muscle types, multi-unit is most like skeletal muscle. It is made of discrete fibers. Nerve stimulation causes contraction. And we have very fine control compared to the other kind of smooth muscle, which is unitary smooth muscle, right? So now the interesting thing is we don't have multi-unit smooth muscle very many places in the body. Ciliary muscle is the eye. That's the muscle that controls your lens shape in your eye. The iris, that's the open and close of the pupil. And the piloerector muscles are goosebump muscles. Those are smooth, multi-unit smooth muscle examples. 3 places, not very many places, right? Much more common in the body is unitary smooth muscle, which is also called syncytial smooth muscle. A syncytium is a group of things working together. All right, that's what that word means. You're going to hear that word a few times in this semester, so just get it out there. A syncytium is a group of cells working together. So when we talk about syncytial smooth muscle, we call it that because we have lots of different individual muscle cells, smooth muscle cells, but they all work in a coordinated fashion. Remember that skeletal muscle is really weird as far as cells go. Like skeletal muscle are many cells that have joined together, right? Remember that skeletal muscle is multinucleate, which means it starts its life as multiple cells and then they kind of join together into a big giant metacell. That's a sarcomere or a myofibril. Smooth muscle, the cells stay independent and individual. Okay. Now, there's benefits to this. Skeletal muscle cells don't divide, right? In other words, if a muscle is severely damaged, it won't grow back. right? It's going to scar down instead. You have to have the original, some at least, of the original myofibrils, which will hypertrophy to replace. They don't divide and replace like stem cells or daughter cells do. Smooth muscle, because we have multiple individual cells, they replace themselves much easier. This is good because we have smooth muscle in so many places that undergo damage. You know, like an artery, for example. Arteries are damaged. If the smooth muscle didn't grow back, the smooth muscle in the wall of the arteries would just scar down and we would have major problems. So it works together. So we have cells that work in collaboration. For unitary smooth muscle, most contraction is not by the neural system. Most contraction is controlled chemically or environmentally, right? So if you think about your digestive tract, for example, your digestive tract does not contract because the brain tells it to. Your digestive system contracts because it's an autonomous organ that manages itself, right? So this is one of the big differences between skeletal muscle and smooth muscle, is that it's not controlled. Smooth muscle is not controlled by neurons. The membranes of these muscles are very tightly adhered together. And, you know, we talked a little bit about cytoskeleton the other day. In smooth muscle, the cytoskeleton of one cell is connected to the cytoskeleton of its neighbor, which means that the connections are very tight and very strong. This is important because, like, if you think about this, you know, make a full circle out of it, well, or your stomach, the stomach can't contract around a thing if the connections between cells aren't strong. Otherwise, when it tried to contract, it would just pull apart, you see. So we have these tight arrangements that allows the cells to transmit force together. We find this kind of muscle all over the body. Now, there is still an arrangement. So even though there's no sarcomeres, we still have not linear, but we have directionality to smooth muscle cells. You know, so for example, here we see that these smooth muscle cells are going around this vessel, which makes sense because when it contracts, it's going to get smaller. Whereas in the uterus, for example, we have two sort of different orientations of smooth muscle. One squeezes and one pushes down, right? So you can still have different force arrangements even though you don't have sarcomeres. This is what I need here. No, wrong one. Yeah, there. Okay, so actin and myosin are present. They behave in the same way. In other words, when the actin sites are exposed, myosin's going to bind, myosin cross bridges pull together, right? So they are in a different arrangement. So we have a different style of contraction. We don't get linear contraction. It kind of goes in a sheet. Actin and myosin cross bridges are slow to form and break in smooth muscle, much slower than they are in skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle is never about speed. It's about strength, right? And that makes sense because why do you need speed in a muscle? You need it to be able to respond to something. Well, the nervous system has skeletal muscle that can respond fast enough to catch a ball. We don't have to catch anything with our smooth muscle, right? It just has to sit there and do its thing over hours and hours and hours. So the bridges are slow to form and spend more time linked. What this means is it means that pound for pound, smooth muscle has more force. It can develop more force than skeletal muscle can. Smooth muscle is much more efficient. It spends much less energy per unit tension over time. This is important because much of the smooth muscle in the body is contracting at least a little all the time. So we need it to be efficient so that we're not wasting a lot of ATP. The contraction is much slower. Okay, a skeletal muscle can contract in less than a second. Smooth muscle is going to take 1 to 3 seconds. So 5 to 15 times as long. Okay. There again, that's fine because smooth muscle is all about organ work, not about matching an environment. The maximum force per volume is generally higher than skeletal muscle. And smooth muscle has something skeletal muscle doesn't at all, which is it has a latching mechanism. What this means is, so imagine you've got the sliding filaments, right? Actin and myosin are being pulled together. Well, in a skeletal muscle, if you take the calcium away, titin's going to just put that back, right? It's going to relax. Well, in smooth muscle, when you get contraction, the actin and myosin can be kind of like bound together so that they don't pull back apart, even when the muscle is relaxed. So that helps to improve our efficiency. The actin and myosin can stay bound together, and it kind of holds the muscle in contraction with very little energy. And then the length-tension relationships, remember the graphs we saw today, are very different in smooth muscle. Smooth muscle can contract at full strength over a much wider range of lengths than skeletal muscle can. So I think the big trade-offs, skeletal or smooth muscle is very flexible, it's very strong, it's very efficient. What it is not is responsive and fast, right? So skeletal muscle is going to catch the ball, smooth muscle is going to squeeze the bladder, right? So they have different purposes, so they have different evolved characteristics. All right, so what is the mechanism for contraction? I said it was still calcium, but the system is a lot older. It's a lot less refined. So in skeletal muscle, the calcium that causes contraction comes from inside the cell, right, from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. In smooth muscle, the calcium that causes contraction comes from outside the cell. It has to come from the extracellular fluid. Calcium enters, then something strange happens. The smooth muscle does have a sarcoplasmic reticulum, but it's kind of old school and doesn't work very well, right? So it doesn't have enough calcium in it to trigger contraction all by itself. We still need calcium from the outside. The calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum just adds to the effect, right? So it's additive. So the calcium that enters from both places, it's going to join with this protein called calmodulin. Calmodulin kind of plays the same role as troponin does in skeletal muscle. And that is calmodulin binds to calcium and then triggers the production of inactive MLCK to active MLCK. MLCK then triggers the activation of myosin. It phosphorylates myosin. Once myosin is phosphorylated, then it can interact with actin and we can get muscle contraction. So you can see that the process is different, even though the players are the same. Calcium is still the trigger, actin and myosin are still the workers, right? But the connection is different. We're through calmodulin and MLCK to cause contraction. Right, okay. Well, what about relaxation? Relaxation is basically the inverse, okay? There is no reverse MCLK though. We have a different enzyme, myosin phosphatase, peels the phosphates off of myosin. That causes the myosin to inactivate. That triggers relaxation. Okay. Now we only get this though when our calcium concentration is low. How do we get? In other words, myosin phosphatase is activated by a reduction in calcium in the cell. How do we get the calcium out? The calcium is removed from calmodulin. It's pumped out of the cell through a calcium pump and pumped into the SR through a different calcium pump, right? So the calcium is pumped out. Another way that calcium is evicted from the cell is from the calcium-sodium cotransporter. Remember, whenever I say cotransporter, think about the diffusion gradients, right? Sodium is falling down its concentration gradient, right, from high to low, and it's pushing calcium up. Do you see that? So it's a free pump. We're letting sodium do the work of pumping calcium out. Now, these are not free pumps, but they all work together to do the same thing, which is reduce calcium in the cell so that the myosin phosphatase can inactivate the myosin, and then we get relaxation. Now, one thing that's very true about both of these systems, in skeletal muscle, it's kind of an all or nothing thing, right? The muscle is either contracting or it's not. Smooth muscle, it isn't that clear. You can have sort of a half contraction, like you can have the amount of calcium that enters can vary. So like if a cell has a lot of calcium enter, it's going to contract really strongly. If it has just a little calcium that enters, it's going to contract less strongly. So where the skeletal muscle has sort of an on or off mentality, smooth muscle has more of a ratchet it up, dial it up, dial it down kind of a thing because of how the systems are different. Still calcium, and remember calmodulin kind of plays the same role as troponin does. All right, so what does excite smooth muscle? What causes the original contraction? What causes the calcium to enter in the first place? Well, it depends on what smooth muscle you're looking at, okay? Smooth muscle excitation can be either by nerves or by chemicals, hormones, chemical messengers. Both things happen. Like in our multi-unit smooth muscle, it is activated by neurons. But we don't have to have neurons that, here's our multi-unit. We don't have to have neurons to have smooth muscle function because, like in the digestive tract, this receptor, this channel, is a chemical channel, right? It responds to hormones instead of the nervous system. The excitation can be either nerves or by hormones. Unlike skeletal muscle, there's an up and a down. It can be excitatory or inhibitory. There's no inhibitory signal in skeletal muscle, right? It's only excitatory. But smooth muscle, you can turn it up or you can turn it down. So there's inhibition and excitation. In unitary smooth muscle, the cells, the cytoplasm of the cells are connected together through gap junctions. Gap junctions are a little bit like a straw or a doorway between two cells. It allows ions in one cell to travel to another cell, right? That's a gap junction. Well, if you think about how an action potential works, it means that if we have a membrane potential change in one cell and we have gap junctions, that membrane potential change is going to be transmitted to another cell. So it's the gap junctions that let unitary smooth muscle work together. So it means that when one area of smooth muscle depolarizes, it depolarizes the rest of the smooth muscle too. So it allows the whole syncytium to work together to accomplish a thing. The action potential patterns that we see in smooth muscle are quite a bit different than what we see in skeletal muscle. In skeletal muscle, we kind of see the classic action potential. But instead, in smooth muscle, we see these spike patterns where we'll get a rapid up and down depolarization, repolarization, or we get slow waves. And at the top of the slow waves, we have these spikes that come up. And then in some smooth muscle, we get this pattern where we have this section right here is called the plateau. And in the plateau, this is from calcium coming in, which we're going to talk in great detail in cardiac muscle here later this week.